I still remember the way my son's eyes cut through me that evening, as sharp and cold as broken glass. In a room filled with applause, chandeliers and champagne glasses clinking, his look told me everything I wasn't welcome. It hit harder than any blow I'd taken in the steel mill during all those years I worked to keep food on our table. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Chicago was alive that night. The heart of the city pulsed outside the tall windows of the grand ballroom where Greg's company was holding its launch. Limos lined the street, men in tailored suits shook hands, and women in gowns sparkled like sequins under the lights. Inside, the music from a live jazz band floated in the air, smooth and expensive. I stood in the back, wearing my best coat, 10 years old now, but clean and pressed. I thought maybe if I kept to the shadows I could just watch and feel a bit of pride and then slip out unnoticed. But pride is a dangerous thing. It fools you into stepping closer. I inched forward through the crowd. I saw Greg on the stage, tall, handsome 35, and every bit the successful businessman he wanted the world to believe. His dark hair was slicked back, his smile easy. Cameras flashed as he spoke into the microphone, thanking his investors, talking about vision, growth, and legacy. Words I had never used in my life because my life had been about paychecks, rent money, and making sure the heat stayed on during long Chicago winters. I caught sight of Linda Parker standing off to the side. She was a neighbor of mine for 30 years, a widow like me, and sharp as they come when it came to property. She wore her usual, no-nonsense gray suit, holding a small notebook against her chest. Her eyes found mine, and she gave the slightest shake of her head, almost like she already knew what was about to happen. Still, I stepped forward. My heart beat louder than the jazz. Greg's voice carried over the speakers. This company is proof of hard work, resilience, and the American dream. From nothing, we built this foundation into a tower of success. From nothing. Those words burned. I remembered the mortgage payment I had made for him, the land deal I had secured with the savings from my pension, the car I had sold so he could pay tuition. Nothing, he called it. Nothing at all. I walked closer to the stage, close enough now that the front rows began to notice me. Heads turned. Whispers started. One man in a pinstripe suit leaned toward his wife and muttered loud enough for me to hear, "Isn't that the father?" "He looks like some retiree who wandered in from the street." My face grew hot, but I kept moving. When Greg saw me, his smile froze. He cleared his throat and shifted his stance. The camera flashes seemed to pop louder, faster. Then into the microphone his voice snapped, "Dad, stay out of this. This is my business, my world." A wave of murmurs rolled through the hall. Someone chuckled, another scoffed. I caught fragments, embarrassing, shouldn't be here living off his son. I stopped the sting of his words, digging deeper than I thought I could bear. I wanted to tell them the truth. I wanted to shout about the nights I'd worked double shifts, about the land I had signed over so he could build this empire. But my throat closed. So I just set the leather briefcase I had carried with me on a nearby chair. It looked out of place among the handbags and designer clutches, old, scratched the kind of case that smelled faintly of engine oil. Then I turned shoulders heavy and made my way toward the exit. The laughter followed me, muffled but sharp, echoing louder in my head than in the room itself. Outside, the Chicago night was cold. I leaned against the wall of the building, breathing in the frost, staring at the steam rising from the manholes. Linda came out after a moment, her heels clicking on the pavement. "You shouldn't have gone up there," she said gently, her voice softer than her usual business-like tone. I shook my head. "I just wanted to see him, Linda. To congratulate him, that's all." She studied me with eyes that had seen enough real estate deals to know when something didn't add up. "Greg's building this empire on your back, Arthur, and he doesn't want the world to know it. You'd better be ready. He'll erase you if he can." Her words settled in my chest like a weight. I thought of Mary, my late wife, how she had always believed Greg would do better, be better. She used to say, "He's got your determination, Arthur. Don't let him forget where he came from." But as I watched the glow of the ballroom lights from the outside, I knew he already had. The memory of that night clung to me like smoke. I thought by the next morning it might settle, but the sting followed me into every corner of my small apartment. I woke early, The city still half asleep outside my window, the radiator ticking like an old clock. I made a pot of coffee, the kind that tastes bitter no matter how much sugar you put in, and I sat at the kitchen table staring at my worn briefcase. It was still there just as I had set it down after trudging home from Greg's gala. The leather cracked, the handle frayed. Inside lay the deeds and contracts I'd collected over the years, proof of sacrifices that had kept Greg afloat long before he had his investors and cameras. Proof of what he chose to erase. I should have felt anger, and I did in flashes. But what weighed on me more was the humiliation, the way his words echoed in my head, amplified by the chuckles of strangers. Dad, stay out of this. My world. By the weekend, I forced myself out of the apartment. The walls were closing in on me. I took the bus downtown, deciding to walk near the river where Mary and I used to stroll when life still felt simple. I found myself drifting past newsstands, each one carrying papers with Greg's face on the cover. Headlines about his vision, his remarkable rise. Not a word about who made it possible. I ducked into a diner near State Street, the kind of place that smelled of bacon grease and strong coffee. I took a booth in the corner. The waitress, Ruby, a woman about my age with tired eyes, poured me a cup before I asked. "Rough day," she said kindly. I gave a half smile. "Been a rough few years, Ruby." She didn't pry. Folks of our generation usually didn't. We carried our burdens quietly. Halfway through my eggs, I noticed two men in suits at the counter. They had a copy of the Chicago Tribune open between them, Greg's photo taking up half the page. One of them tapped the picture with a greasy finger. Smart kid. Built it from scratch. Makes you believe in the American dream again. My stomach twisted. From scratch. They had no idea. I looked down at my plate, pushing the eggs around with my fork, trying to steady my breathing. That afternoon, Linda stopped by my apartment. She carried a folder under her arm, her heels clicking on the worn linoleum, as if she were walking into a courtroom. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, studying my face. "You're quieter than usual," she said. "I was humiliated in front of 100 people, Linda. My own son made me out to be nothing. Hard to find words after that." She tapped the folder. "Arthur, you still hold leverage. He may have erased you in that ballroom, but the foundation under his empire, it's yours. The question is, do you plan to remind him I rub my temples? I don't know. Maybe I just want peace." "Peace doesn't come when someone's cutting you out of your own bloodline," she said firmly. "I've seen men your age shoved into the background, stripped of everything they worked for. You don't deserve that." Her words stirred something in me, though I wasn't ready to admit it. That evening, I turned on the TV to catch the local news. There was Greg again, standing tall, smiling for the cameras, as if he hadn't ripped the ground out from under me just days earlier. The reporter asked him about the company's origins, and without missing a beat, Greg said, "This building proves I built everything from the ground up." I felt my hand tighten around the armrest of my chair until my knuckles ached. He wasn't just ignoring me now. He was rewriting history. I switched off the TV, the screen going black with a faint buzz. In the silence, I heard Mary's voice in my memory. Her gentle reminder that character mattered more than wealth, that family meant loyalty. I wondered what she would say now if she could see our son standing on a stage declaring he had built it all alone. I leaned back the recliner, groaning, and stared at the ceiling. My humiliation was no longer a private wound. It was becoming a story told by others in newspapers, on TV, and diners across the city. A story in which I was nothing more than an afterthought, or worse, a burden. The days that followed carried the same sting like a bruise that refused to fade. Every corner store, every diner, even the barber shop down the street seemed to carry Greg's name in one way or another. People admired his rise, his polish, the story of a man who had supposedly built an empire from the dust. I stopped by the church one Sunday morning, not because I wanted to, but because routine pulled me there. Pastor John gave his sermon about humility and gratitude, words that landed heavier than usual in my chest. Afterward, folks gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee and donuts. I overheard two men talking near the bulletin board. Greg Miller, one said, shaking his head in admiration. "A real self-made man." I turned my back, pretending to study the flyers for the upcoming potluck. My hands shook slightly as I tucked them into my pockets. Self-made. The phrase was becoming a curse, repeated like gospel, stripping me out of my own story. Linda found me sitting alone at one of the folding tables. She set down a paper cup of coffee in front of me. "You can't keep letting this eat at you," she said. I forced a smile. "And what would you suggest truth has a way of waiting?" she replied. "But the longer you let him run with his version, the deeper the roots grow. People believe what they hear first." Her words gnawed at me all afternoon. By evening, I returned to my apartment and pulled the briefcase onto my lap. The papers were in order, old deeds, contracts, transfers, signed in ink that still bore the weight of my sacrifices. They were more than just records. They were pieces of my life, each line, another shift at the mill, another meal skipped, another promise I'd made to my family. But sitting with them didn't make me feel powerful. Not yet. It made me feel tired. It was a gray morning when Linda showed up at my door, her expression as sharp as the winter air that slipped in behind her. She didn't bother with small talk, just marched into my kitchen like she'd been rehearsing what she needed to say all night. "Arthur," she began, setting her bag on the table. "Your son is moving faster than you think. I've heard whispers about a reverse mortgage application. If I'm right, he's aiming it straight at your apartment." I blinked at her, the words sinking in slowly. "My place. That's impossible." "He wouldn't," Linda cut me off with a firm shake of her head. "Don't be naive. I've dealt with enough of these deals to know the signs. If he convinces a bank that you've signed off, or worse, if someone produces the paperwork on your behalf, you could lose this roof over your head before you even know it." I sat down heavily, the chair creaking under me. My apartment wasn't much, 2 rooms, a worn recliner, and the smell of old wood that never quite left the walls, but it was mine. It was all I had left of a life that used to be bigger. The thought of Greg trying to snatch it out from under me felt like a second betrayal layered on the first. Linda slid a folded envelope across the table. "This came to my office by mistake. It should have gone to you. I opened it by accident, but I figured you'd want to see." I hesitated before pulling out the papers. The letterhead of a downtown bank stared back at me. My name was there, typed neatly alongside Greg's company information. At the bottom, a note about property evaluations and potential collateral. My stomach clenched. I whispered more to myself than to Linda. "He's really doing it." She leaned forward. "Arthur, you can't let this go. You need to protect yourself before it's too late." I wanted to argue, to defend Greg, even after all he'd done, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself staring at Mary's photograph again, the one that sat on the shelf above the counter. What would she say if she knew our son was circling like a hawk, ready to take the last thing I had? Linda's voice softened. "I know you want to believe he'll turn around, but you and I both know the man on those TV screens isn't the boy you raised. He's not coming back, Arthur. Not unless something forces him to face the truth." Her words hung heavy in the room. That night after Linda left, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my recliner, with the bank letter on my lap, the radiator hissing beside me. My mind wrestled between 2 choices: let Greg have his way in the name of peace, or finally take a stand. I poured myself a glass of water and walked to the closet. It had been years since I opened the old lockbox on the top shelf. My fingers trembled as I turned the key and pulled it down. Inside were the documents I'd guarded for decades, deeds, receipts, contracts, and they're yellowed at the edges. But still clear was the old agreement for the land Greg's company now stood on. I held it under the lamp, tracing the ink with my finger. My name, Arthur Miller, bold and unshaken. His empire might glitter on the outside, but its foundation carried my signature. For the first time since the humiliation of that ballroom, I felt something steady take root inside me. The old document trembled slightly in my hands, not because of the draft from the window, but because of what it meant. For years I had let Greg take credit, let him stand on stages and pretend the ground he walked on was earned all by himself. But this paper yellowed, though it was carried the weight of truth. I set it on the table, smoothing the creases as if it were a living thing that needed calming. Memories surged, signing that deed after months of haggling, scraping together money from my pension. Mary's face lighting up when I told her we'd secured something solid for Greg's future. We thought we were giving him a gift. We never imagined he'd turn it into a weapon. The apartment was quiet, except for the ticking of the radiator. I sat there staring at the deed until my eyes blurred. A thought gnawed at me. Maybe I could still confront Greg, talk sense into him before this spiraled further. but the echo of his voice at that gala, "Stay out of this." My world snapped the thought in half. He wasn't a boy anymore. He wasn't even the man Mary believed he'd become. He was someone else entirely, someone who saw me as an obstacle to be cleared away. The next morning I walked down to check the mail. The lobby smelled faintly of bleach, the kind of smell that lingers after the janitor makes his rounds. In my box was another envelope from the bank. My hands shook as I opened it right there in the lobby. It was addressed to me, but the contents read like a formality: confirmation of inquiries. Made on my behalf lines I had never signed, phone calls I had never made. Neighbors passed by with grocery bags and strollers, nodding politely, but I barely noticed. My knees felt weak. Greg wasn't just thinking about taking my place. He was already setting the gears in motion. I carried the letter upstairs and laid it next to the old deed. The two papers sat side by side, one a relic of sacrifice, the other a sign of betrayal. I stared at them until I could no longer deny what Linda had warned me about. This wasn't paranoia. It was happening. That evening, Linda came by again. I handed her the new letter without saying a word. She read it quickly, her jaw tightening. "He's accelerating the process," she said. "Arthur, this is no longer about waiting. You need to prepare." I rubbed my forehead. "Prepare how? I'm no lawyer. I'm no businessman. I'm just—" "You're the man who holds the deed," she interrupted firmly. "Don't forget that. Greg can polish his speeches and charm investors, but without this piece of paper, he's standing on air. The question is, when do you want to use it?" Her eyes locked onto mine, steady and unyielding. I realized she wasn't just talking about documents. She was asking when I would stop being a bystander in my own life. That night, I placed the deed back into the lockbox, sliding it under the bed where it had slept for years, but I didn't lock it this time. I wanted it close ready. Every creak of the apartment, every hum of the radiator reminded me that I was on borrowed peace. I leaned back in my recliner, staring at Mary's picture. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," I whispered. "But if he comes for this place, I'll have no choice." The lamp flickered, casting the room in and out of shadow. For the first time, I wasn't just a father licking old wounds. I was a man holding a weapon Greg didn't know I had. I hadn't been to Greg's house in months, maybe longer. It wasn't for lack of trying on my part, just the quiet knowledge that I wasn't welcome. But Rachel called one afternoon, her voice sweet, in that rehearsed way of hers, inviting me over for a family dinner. She said it was just a casual gathering, nothing fancy, but the way she emphasized it made me suspicious. Still, I accepted. Maybe part of me wanted to believe there was still room at their table for me. When I arrived, the smell of roasted chicken and garlic drifted from the kitchen. Their home was a spacious, modern, full of the kind of gleam you get from decorators and expensive fixtures. I stepped inside, clutching a small box of pastries from the corner bakery. "Mary used to say you never showed up to dinner empty-handed." Rachel greeted me at the door, her smile tight. "Arthur, good to see you. Come in." Greg was already at the dining table with their two kids' phones glowing in their hands while they poked at the appetizers. He looked up briefly, nodded, and went back to his screen. Not a word. I sat down slowly, setting the pastries in the middle of the table. "Brought a little something," I said, trying to sound lighthearted. "From Baker's down on 5th. Mary always loved their pecan tarts." Rachel glanced at the box without opening it. "That's nice." Dinner moved along in stilted patches of conversation, most of it between Rachel and Greg about business contacts, school schedules, weekend plans. I tried to join in, asking the kids about their classes, their soccer games, but got nothing more than shrugs and half smiles before they buried themselves back in their screens. Finally, I cleared my throat, searching for a thread to hold on to. "Greg, I saw the article in the Tribune last week. Quite the spread. You looked proud up there." His fork froze for just a second before he resumed cutting into his chicken. "Yeah, it was a good piece." I wanted him to elaborate, to acknowledge me even slightly. Instead, silence filled the space. That's when Rachel leaned in, her voice as sharp as the knife in her hand. "We don't owe you anything, Arthur. You know that, right?" The words hit me like a slap. Greg didn't look up. He didn't correct her. His silence was permission enough. I sat back, the fork heavy in my hand, my heart pounding against my ribs. I wanted to remind them of everything, of the land, the payments, the sacrifices. But I could see in Rachel's eyes and Greg's silence that nothing I said would matter. To them, I was no longer a father. I was just an old man at their table, tolerated out of obligation. I placed my fork down gently as though setting down something fragile. "I see," I said quietly. The rest of the meal blurred. I barely tasted the food. My thoughts spiraled, the hum of conversation fading into static. By the time dessert was brought out, I had already made up my mind. I stood, thanked them for dinner, and excused myself. Walking out into the cool night air, I felt lighter in one sense, heavier in another. The final thread that tied me to the role of father in that house had snapped. Whatever I had been to Greg once I wasn't anymore. I walked the neighborhood for a while before heading back to my apartment, the cool air clearing my head more than any cup of coffee ever could. The streets were quiet, just the occasional dog barking or porch light flickering. By the time I stepped inside my place, the silence felt heavier than usual. I sat in my recliner staring at the ceiling, replaying Rachel's words in my mind. "We don't owe you anything." The cruelty of it wasn't just in the words, but in Greg's silence. He had every chance to step in to correct her, to remind her that I was still his father, but he didn't. For years I had tried to excuse him. The pressure of business, the influence of Rachel, the demands of life. But that night stripped away the excuses. He was no longer just my son caught in someone else's sway. He had made his choice, and that choice was to cut me out. I don't know how long I sat there lost in thought when a knock rattled my door. It was Linda. She had a way of showing up when the weight grew too heavy. She studied my face for a moment before speaking. "It didn't go well, did it?" I shook my head. She said, "They don't owe me anything." And Greg? He didn't say a word. Not one word. Linda sighed, pulling out a chair across from me. "Arthur, I've known you a long time. You've carried yourself with more patience than most men I know. But patience has its limits. Maybe it's time to remind them who you really are." Her words stirred something deep inside me. A reminder that I wasn't just a man sitting quietly in the corner of someone else's life. I was the one who had built the foundation, who had sacrificed in ways they would never understand. I leaned forward, my hands clasped tight. "And what if I do remind them?" What then? Linda's eyes didn't waver. "Then the story changes. Right now, they're writing you out of it. You have the proof. Use it. Before they bury you under their version of events." The thought of it scared me, but it also gave me a strange sense of strength. For too long I'd been waiting for Greg to turn back to see me again as his father. But maybe Linda was right. Maybe the only way forward was to stop waiting. After she left, I sat alone with the quiet. My gaze drifted to the lockbox under the bed, to the deed inside, the paper that proved everything. My hands itched to pull it out, to hold it again, but instead I reached for the phone. The number came to me slowly, like a song half remembered. Mr. Thompson, an old lawyer I had worked with years ago when Mary and I first bought our home. He was older now, retired from the big firm, but last I heard he still kept a small practice in town. A man who knew my name, my history, and who I trusted. My fingers trembled as I dialed. The ring buzzed in my ear, each tone echoing like a drumbeat. When his voice finally answered, steady, familiar, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just a father who had been silenced. I was a man about to speak again. The phone call to Mr. Thompson had stirred something inside me. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't walking alone in the dark. But nothing could have prepared me for what unfolded just days later. I woke to the sound of the morning news blaring from my old television. The anchor's voice was urgent, his words sharp enough to pull me fully awake. Breaking news out of downtown Chicago this morning. Authorities accompanied by bank officials have arrived at the headquarters of Miller Enterprises. The building has been officially sealed, pending investigation into ownership documents and financial discrepancies. I sat bolt upright, my coffee forgotten on the counter. The screen showed a sea of flashing red and blue lights. News vans parked at every angle and officers lining the steps of Greg's building. Behind them, men in dark suits slapped bright red seals across the glass doors. And then there was Greg. My son stood on the sidewalk in his tailored suit, looking like a man stripped bare. Cameras shoved toward him, reporters shouted questions, and his eyes darted wildly, searching for an answer that wouldn't come. "This is a mistake," he barked, his voice breaking. "This is my company. You can't just shut it down." But the officers didn't flinch. The cameras caught every word, every desperate gesture. I could almost hear the murmurs of the crowd gathered on the street. Employees, investors, passers-by, all watching the golden boy of Chicago business unravel in real time. By the afternoon, the story had spread to every channel, every paper. The mighty Miller Enterprises was on its knees. Later that day, I sat in my recliner as the evening news replayed the footage. Greg's face filled the screen, red with rage and panic, as the red seals clung to the glass doors behind him. Rachel stood at his side, her arms folded, lips pressed tight. At one point, the camera caught her snapping at him, her voice sharp even through the chaos. "I told you not to push so hard." He snapped back, his voice cracking. "Don't you dare blame me for this." The reporters ate it up, broadcasting every second of the marital spat, replaying it as though it were theater. And in some ways it was. The empire Greg had built on pride and borrowed ground was crumbling before the eyes of the city. I should have felt triumph, but sitting there, in my dim apartment, the radiator groaning and the smell of reheated soup filling the air, I only felt a heavy, complicated ache. Greg was my son. No matter what he had done, no matter how far he had gone to erase me, seeing him unravel in public like that cut deeper than I expected. And yet, beneath the ache, there was something else. A cold certainty that this was only the beginning. As the broadcast shifted, a new voice joined the noise. A reporter leaned toward the camera, her tone brimming with intrigue. Sources close to the investigation suggest that Greg Miller may not be the true owner of the building housing Miller Enterprises. Questions are being raised about documents linking the property to another name. By the next morning, the fallout was impossible to ignore. Every newspaper at the corner stand carried the same image, Greg standing helplessly outside the building, his hands raised, as though he could hold back the tide with sheer will. Headlines screamed words like, "Scandal Collapse Seized." I bought a copy and read it slowly over my coffee. Miss Carter, one of Greg's biggest investors, had already withdrawn her funds. Others were lining up to do the same. The article quoted her directly. "We trusted Greg Miller's leadership. What we discovered was smoke and mirrors. Our money deserves safer ground." The words must have gutted him more than any seal on a door. Later that afternoon, I turned on the television and saw the swarm of reporters camped outside Greg's suburban home. Rachel tried to usher the kids inside, shielding them from the flashing cameras. Greg came to the porch, his face pale, jaw tight. "This is all temporary," he shouted. "We'll get this fixed. The truth will come out." But the crowd wasn't convinced. Questions fired like bullets. "Mr. Miller, are you the legal owner of the building? What role did your father play in the acquisition? Did you falsify records to secure loans?" Each question made him flinch. He tried to walk back inside, but Rachel grabbed his arm, hissing loud enough for the microphones to catch. "You said you had this under control." His reply was a growl. "Shut up, Rachel. Not now." The footage replayed across the evening broadcast, the soundbite dissected by analysts who smelled blood. I sat in the dim light of my apartment, the newspaper folded neatly on the table beside me. For the first time, the city was beginning to suspect the truth that Greg was not the sole architect of his empire, that someone else's name lingered beneath the foundation. And in that moment, I understood something I didn't need to lift a finger yet. The cracks were widening on their own. Greg's pride had built the tower too tall too quickly, and now gravity was doing the rest. Still, I knew better than to sit idle. I pulled out my old notebook, the one I hadn't touched in years, and began jotting down dates, transactions names. Mr. Thompson would need everything organized when the time came. Outside my window, the city buzzed with the noise of sirens and traffic. But in my small apartment, there was only the quiet scratch of pen against paper and the steady beat of my heart. The rumor had already taken on a life of its own. Every channel, every newspaper hinted that Greg might not be the rightful owner of the building. Still, whispers were not enough. People believed what they saw, and until I showed my face, the story was unfinished. Linda was the one who pushed me. "Arthur," she said one evening at the diner, leaning across the booth, "this is your chance. You can't let the speculation fade. You've got the proof, and you've got the right. If you stay silent now, Greg will twist it again." Her words hit me harder than the bitter coffee in my cup. She was right. The time for patience had passed. The next morning I dressed in my best suit, the same one I'd worn to Mary's funeral years ago. It was a little tighter now, the shoulders stiff, but it carried a kind of quiet dignity. Linda met me outside, her hair pinned back, a folder clutched under her arm. Together, we walked toward the press conference arranged by Mr. Thompson. The crowd was already buzzing when we arrived. Reporters jostled, cameras clicked, and the air was thick with anticipation. At the front, a podium waited, flanked by microphones bristling like porcupine quills. I felt my pulse in my throat, but Linda's steady hand on my arm kept me moving forward. When Mr. Thompson stepped up first, his voice cut through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. My client Arthur Miller has something important to share regarding the property housing Miller Enterprises." The murmurs rose instantly. I could see the confusion ripple across the faces, hear the whispered repetition of my name. I took the podium, slowly adjusting the microphone. For a moment, I looked out at the sea of expectant faces at the cameras broadcasting my every breath. And then I spoke. "My name is Arthur Miller. I am the legal owner of the land beneath the building you've all seen on the news. Decades ago, I purchased and secured it, believing it would give my son a future. Those documents still bear my name, my signature, and they have never changed hands." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters shoved closer, the sound of shutters rapid and insistent. Somewhere in the chaos, I saw Greg at the edge of the crowd. His face had drained of color, his lips parting in disbelief. I held the folder aloft, the papers Linda had so carefully preserved. "This is the truth. Success built on betrayal can't stand. And no matter how bright a facade might shine, a foundation built on lies will always crack." The words echoed in my own ears as though Mary herself had whispered them to me. For the first time in a long time, I felt steady, solid, like a man reclaiming his place. For a moment, the crowd seemed frozen. Then the questions erupted all at once. Microphones shoved forward, voices clashing over one another. "Mr. Miller, why reveal this now? Did your son know what happens to Miller Enterprises?" I held my ground, the weight of decades behind me. I stayed silent because I thought it would help my son. I believed giving him a chance meant giving him everything. But silence has only bred betrayal. The truth is not new. It was written years ago in these documents. The only difference is that now I refuse to hide it. The flashes blinded me, but I could still make out Greg pushing through the crowd. His suit, once immaculate, was rumpled, his tie hanging loose. When he reached the front, his eyes met mine, and for the first time in years I saw something raw in them, fear. "You can't do this," he hissed, his voice carrying just enough for the microphones to catch. "You'll ruin me." I looked at him steadily, my voice calm. "No, Greg, you did this to yourself. Success built on betrayal can't stand." The words seemed to land heavier than any courtroom gavel. He staggered back a step, his mouth opening but no words coming. The cameras caught every detail, his faltering composure, the way Rachel's hand slipped from his arm, her face twisted in something between anger and shame. Mr. Thompson stepped forward to field the legal questions outlining the validity of the deed. The timeline, the filings that showed my ownership, had never changed. I let his voice carry the technical weight. My role was simpler, to stand visible and unshaken in the place Greg had tried so hard to erase me from. As the press conference wound down, I caught Linda's eye. She gave me the faintest nod, a reminder that this was only one step, not the finish line. But as we walked away from the flashing cameras, I felt lighter, not triumphant, not vengeful, just steady, as if I had finally put my feet on the ground again. Behind us, I could hear the reporters still shout in the chaos swirling around Greg. But their questions weren't for him alone anymore. They were for me too. And that, I realized, was enough for now. In the days that followed, the city seemed to have only one subject on its lips: Greg Miller's fall. Every newspaper stand carried his picture, and not the polished portraits he used to pose for, no. These were shots of him mid-shout, sweat beading on his forehead, eyes wide with desperation. The captions were merciless. From empire to embarrassment, the son who forgot his father, facade crumbles. I would sit at the diner some mornings, nursing my black coffee, listening to the chatter around me. Farmers in worn jackets, mothers with strollers, retirees on their way to church, everyone had an opinion. "Always knew that boy was too slick for his own good," one man muttered from the counter. "He should have remembered where he came from," another replied, shaking her head. I kept my eyes down, stirring my coffee slowly. They didn't realize I was sitting right there, the man behind the headlines. And I wasn't about to correct them. Rachel, meanwhile, became a permanent fixture in the tabloids. The cameras caught her storming out of the house one afternoon, suitcases in hand, shouting into her phone. The anchors replayed the footage on loop, speculating whether the glamorous wife would abandon the sinking ship. Greg himself all but disappeared from view. No more interviews, no more press conferences. His so-called friends, the men who used to toast champagne at his side, stopped taking his calls. The partners who once begged for meetings now avoided his name altogether. I should have felt vindicated, but instead I found myself unsettled. Watching my son unravel publicly was like watching a man drown in slow motion. There was pity tangled with the justice of it, and I couldn't untangle the two. Reporters began calling me, directly knocking on my apartment door at odd hours, offering money for an exclusive. I turned them all away. Fame had never interested me. What mattered wasn't the story they wanted. It was the truth I had already spoken. Nothing more needed to be sold. Still, everywhere I went, whispers followed. At the church potluck on Sunday, people patted my shoulder, some offering congratulations, others awkward sympathy. At bingo night in the community center, the women at my table nudged each other and smiled, as though sitting beside me carried some strange glamour. Even the HOA newsletter in my neighborhood carried a sly mention. Local resident Arthur Miller makes headlines. Through it all, Linda was the only one who treated me the same. She'd show up at my door with her calm presence and a casserole dish, urging me to eat, to rest, to let the world chatter without getting pulled into it. One evening, after another long day of phone calls and letters I sat with her on my porch. The night was cool, the air carrying the smell of cut grass. She looked at me with that steady gaze of hers and asked, "So Arthur, what do you want to do with it now? The building. The land, it's yours outright." What's next? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the dark sky. For so long, the property had been tied to Greg in my mind, to all the hurt and betrayal. But slowly, I felt another possibility stir. "I don't want it to be a monument to what he did wrong," I said quietly. "Maybe it can be something better. Something for the people who've been watching all this unfold. They deserve more than another empty tower." Her brow lifted. "You're thinking of giving it back to the community?" I nodded. "A center. A place where folks can gather, where kids can learn, where no one is turned away. That building's been used to prop up pride long enough. Maybe it's time it stood for something real." Word of my idea spread faster than I expected. I hadn't announced anything publicly yet, but small towns and tight-knit neighborhoods have their ways. By the next Sunday, folks at church were already whispering, "Did you hear Arthur's thinking about turning that building into something for the community? Wouldn't that be something? A place for kids after school, maybe classes for seniors." The thought warmed me more than the weak coffee served in styrofoam cups. For once, the talk wasn't about Greg's disgrace. It was about possibility, about hope. Greg, though, wasn't so easily forgotten. News outlets kept circling him like vultures. They showed footage of him leaving his house, shoulders-hunched reporters hounding him with questions. Rachel was never far behind, her expression icy as she stuffed more bags into her car trunk. Rumor had it she'd already consulted a divorce lawyer. Part of me wanted to call him, to tell him that losing the trappings of power didn't mean losing himself. But then I'd remember the dinner table, Rachel's words, and his silence. He had made his choices. Now he would live with them. Meanwhile, I found myself busier than I had been in years. Mr. Thompson and Linda helped me draw up preliminary plans, zoning permissions, nonprofit registrations, even a few phone calls to local council members. It felt surreal talking about classrooms and community kitchens in the same building that had once been the backdrop of Greg's empire. At the diner one morning, the waitress, a woman named Marcy, who'd known me for decades, refilled my cup and leaned in. "Arthur, I think what you're doing is the right thing. Folks around here need some place to belong. Don't let anyone talk you out of it." I smiled at her words, but deep down I knew the truth. I wasn't doing it just for them. I was doing it for myself too, for Mary, for the years I'd swallowed my pride, for the part of me that had almost let Greg erase me completely. That night, sitting on my porch again with Linda, I finally spoke the thought that had been circling in my mind. "You know, for the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm not just surviving. I feel like I'm building again." She placed her hand on mine, her voice soft. Then let's build something that lasts Arthur. Something he can't tear down no matter what he does. It was late on a Wednesday evening when the knock came at my door. Heavy, uneven, like someone who wasn't sure whether they wanted to be there. I set down the pen I'd been using to sketch out ideas for the community center and shuffled to the door. When I opened it, Greg was standing there. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and for the first time in decades he looked younger, not in a good way, but like a boy who had lost his bearings. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking. Then he dropped to his knees on my porch, the sound of it sharp in the night. Please forgive me. I've lost everything. The company, the investors, Rachel, they're all gone." I froze, my hands still gripping the doorknob. I had dreamed of this moment in so many ways, imagined the satisfaction and the vindication. But standing there watching my son crumble, all I felt was a hollow ache. Before I could answer, another voice cut through the dark. Rachel. She marched up the walkway, heels clicking against the concrete, her face tight with fury. "Greg, get up. This isn't the way. You think groveling will fix this? No. We fight, we sue. That property, that building, it should still be yours. Don't let him take it from you." Greg turned toward her, tears streaking down his face. "Rachel, don't you see it's over? All the lies, the deals, the pretending it's over." She scoffed, her arms folded. "You're pathetic. No wonder everything's fallen apart." I stepped forward, then my voice firm. "Rachel, enough. This isn't about money anymore. It's about the kind of man Greg chose to be." Greg's eyes met mine, wide and wet. "And what kind of man am I, Dad?" The question hung heavy between us. Memories flashed through my mind, his childhood laughter, his teenage defiance, the pride in his eyes when he graduated college, the arrogance that had followed. "You're a man who lost his way," I said softly, "but whether you stay lost, that's up to you." He broke, then sobs racking his shoulders. For all the cameras and lights that had followed his downfall, this was the real collapse, not public, not dramatic, but private and raw, on the porch of the father he had cast aside. Rachel shook her head in disgust, muttering something about lawyers and walking away into the night. Greg didn't even watch her go. I bent down, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Greg, I can't erase what you've done. Neither can you. But you're still my son. The question is, do you want to spend the rest of your life chasing what's gone, or do you want to learn who you really are without it?" He looked up at me, then eyes, swollen lips trembling, and for the first time in years I thought I saw the boy I had once known. Greg stayed on his knees for a long time, the night air carrying only the sound of his uneven breaths. When he finally rose, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow, he looked less like the proud businessman who had stood at ribbon cuttings, and more like the boy who once scraped his knees playing baseball in our yard. "I don't know how to fix this," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Everything I built is gone. Everyone who cheered me on, they've all vanished." I nodded slowly. "That's because what you built wasn't yours to begin with. Not truly. It was borrowed pride, borrowed trust. When that runs out, so does the applause." His lip trembled, and he pressed a hand to his forehead as though trying to hold back the weight of his own mistakes. For a brief moment, I considered reaching further, telling him I'd walk this new road with him, that redemption was possible. But before I could, Rachel's car screeched away from the curb, her taillights glowing like twin embers fading into the night. Greg turned to look, and I could see the last thread of his old life snapping. Tears welled again. "She's gone. They're all gone." I placed a hand on the porch rail, steadying myself. "Greg, maybe that's the point. Maybe you had to lose everything to finally see what matters." He collapsed into the porch chair, burying his face in his hands. I didn't push further. Some lessons aren't taught with words, they're carved out by time, by silence, by the ache of consequences. The next morning I woke with a heaviness, but also with a strange clarity. The city had watched Greg fall, and now they were waiting to see what would rise in the aftermath. They didn't need another speech from him or more denials in the press. They needed a vision of something new. That evening, with Linda and Mr. Thompson at my side, I stood before a packed community hall. Neighbors, former employees, curious reporters, they filled every chair, their faces lit by anticipation. I cleared my throat, gripping the edge of the podium. For too long, this building has been a symbol of pride and division, but it doesn't have to stay that way. I intend to dedicate it to this community to turn it into a center for learning, gathering, and hope. A place where no one is excluded and no one is forgotten. The room erupted into applause, a sound that seemed to lift the very walls. I glanced at Linda, her smile steady, her eyes bright with approval. In the back, I spotted Greg. He wasn't in a suit, just jeans and a jacket. His head bowed, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. When our eyes met, he gave the faintest nod. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but perhaps recognition. I returned the nod, my chest tight. This wasn't the ending I had once imagined. It wasn't triumph or vengeance, but it was something sturdier. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box to the right.